Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club. As we continue to read the book, I Will Die Free by Noble Alexander with Kay Rizzo, the remarkable story dictated by the young pastor Noble Alexander of his life in a Cuban prison, where he was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the gates of hell. In our last reading, we covered chapter 9, entitled Living Beyond Fear, where Noble was transferred to another circular, which housed psychotic murderers, the criminally insane, and the most dangerous of prisoners. At first, he was terrified, but soon realized that this was a blessing from God, since the prisoners were less likely to be punished for errant behavior. He was never more happy to be called insane. In this part of the prison, he was joined by Antonio and other Christian prisoners, and soon they started up their worship services and started teaching classes in English, French, and math, mixed in with the gospel. Soon their numbers grew and reached almost 100. At one time, because one of the Christian brethren lagged back in the work line, the guards opened fire on them all when they tried to gather close to him to protect him. The young man was shot in the leg, and while being transported for medical treatment, the officer in charge shot him in the neck, and the young man became a quadriplegic. They were all moved to a field close to a lake because of the event. And during lunch break, Noble and his friend Brother Balbon were deep in conversation about Balbon's desired baptism, and they did not hear the call to return to work. For punishment, they were sent to pull weeds in the lake, and Noble used the opportunity to baptize Balbon, and they rejoiced at the marvelous workings of God. The chapter ended with one of their Christian number, Roberto Chavez, reaching that breaking point where he chose to go to sleep in Christ rather than continue to be a slave to the beasts the gods had become. He refused to work and was mercilessly beaten and locked in his cell, where he went on a hunger strike. He was transferred to a punishment cell where he could have no visitors. And in just a few days, this Christian young man gave up the ghost and slept in Jesus. We continue our reading today with chapter 10, entitled University Under Shadows. At the beginning of the great re-education plan, the arrogant Captain Morejon predicted that we would weaken, and he promised a gold medal to anyone who resisted the torture and deprivation he inflicted on us. But his prognosis failed. A year passed, and we were far from begging on bended knee for mercy. Faith had led us all the way. It also kindled his fury. At the end of the first year, the frustrated Captain Morejon told his men to do with them as you please. You may kill, stab, beat, do whatever is necessary to implant the red terror in their minds. Lieutenant Aldama, the political instructor of block number 8, leaned against the wall with his arms folded across his chest as our block sergeant completed the first roll call of the day. After the sergeant stepped aside, Aldama swaggered past the line of prisoners, eyeing each of us individually as if looking for flickers of defiance or weakness in our eyes. You're being transferred from work at La Bibijagua to labor at La Reforma, he informed us. There, the sergeant and I will be able to instruct you without interference from outside block number 8. We understood his real meaning perfectly well. In spite of their cruelty, the G2 men treated us better than did the local officers. We were being moved during the day to La Reforma, a work program 45 miles away that produced citrus fruit because the G2 did not supervise that program. The political officer and the sergeant could do anything they wanted, and nobody would be around to interfere or to temper the soldiers' ire. We would be totally at the mercy of these men. The soldiers unleashed their fury upon us almost immediately upon our arrival. The first day of work, Corporal Luis Gesterne, one of the most sadistic of the soldiers, ordered us into a field to cut grass with our teeth. Should a prisoner slow down, the soldiers would open fire on him, killing him instantly. For the least excuse, the soldiers would turn the field into a battlefield. 2 prisoners, Danny Crespo and Eddie Alvarez, were killed on the first day. The next day, a corporal stabbed Julio Tan with his bayonet. After the prisoner fell to the ground, the soldier dug at the wound with his bayonet, opening it further until Julio died from loss of blood. At La Reforma, about 25 of us were assigned to pick tangerines. For starving men to be surrounded by millions of succulent oranges, grapefruit, and tangerines day after day, and not be able to lift even one to their lips, proved torturous. Since the fruit belonged to the people, to eat any would be stealing. Anyone caught stealing would be made to pay for his theft, a bloody price indeed. He would either be stabbed with a bayonet or savagely beaten. There was one significant difference between our former worksite and La Reforma, a welcome one to us. Here, we were able to work side by side with civilians, and though we were forbidden to talk to them or they to us, that rule was next to impossible for the guards to enforce in an orchard full of trees. Short of posting a guard beside every prisoner, there was no way they could stop us. We often talked to civilians quite at length. One day, the former owner of the plantation came out to the orchard. Since the revolution ended and Castro came into power, he and his family no longer owned the property, but only managed it for the government. They told him that if he refused to work for the good of the state, he would lose his home also. Glancing both ways, he said, "I'm not afraid to speak to you prisoners, but I must be careful lest another civilian or one of the guards should overhear us speaking. I've already been reported to the authorities in the past, so now I too have people checking on me, as you do." He nodded toward a cluster of guards standing at the edge of the grove of trees. "As far as I'm concerned, eat as much fruit as you like. Just don't let the guards catch you, and don't tell them that I gave you permission to eat it. I don't want to get into any more trouble." While I became acquainted with the plantation owner, other prisoners formed friendships with the civilian workers. Carlos Sanchez, one of our Christian brothers, struck up a friendship with one of the local farm boys. Always enthusiastic about Jesus, Carlos shared his faith with the young man. After a while, the boy became interested in learning more. "You must meet the pastor," Carlos informed him. He brought the young man to meet me. We chatted for some time regarding the promises in God's Word. "I have a Bible," the farm boy admitted. "Not the whole Bible, but a part of one. You may have it if you like. I can get another on the street." The next day, he handed a brown paper bag with the book inside to Carlos. After glancing about to be certain no one was watching, Carlos thanked the boy. Then, checking to be certain they had not been observed, Carlos buried the package at the end of the citrus grove. Unfortunately, someone did overhear the conversation and saw the package. A few days later, the prison commandant ordered the guards to bring Carlos and me to his office. While the commandant questioned us, another officer searched our cells for the package. Neither man learned anything. Instead of following up the questioning with the usual torture, the commandant ordered us back to our cells. "That's strange," Carlos commented. "No torture, no discipline." I shrugged, for lack of a better response. During the week following our questioning, Carlos and I were sent on different work assignments. The next week, they reassigned us to the fruit grove where Carlos had hidden the Bible. Upon arriving at the grove, Carlos returned to the spot where he'd hidden the book. After digging it up, he wrapped it in a scrap of plastic from an empty fertilizer bag. We often used the empty plastic bags as ponchos to protect us from the rains. He slipped the package beneath his shirt and placed his metal dinner plate between the Bible and his shirt. The prison's political instruction officer had bided his time and won. A guard who had been assigned to watch Carlos immediately reported his actions. Carlos had just hidden his treasure when a sniper shot rang out. Startled, Carlos fell on his face, cutting his lip on a sharp stone. Before I could discover just what had happened, the political instructor rushed forward, shouting and accusing him of trying to escape. The guards scooped Carlos into a truck and drove off in a flurry of gravel, while the remaining guards ordered the rest of us back to work. That night, back at the prison, Carlos told us what happened. The guards drove him to the military hospital and rushed him into the doctor's examining room. Blood had dripped from his cut lip onto his clothing during the frantic ride to the hospital. The minute he arrived in the examination room, the doctor tore the clothing off his body. After checking him all over, the doctor stepped back and asked the political instructor why Carlos had been brought to his office. "Because we shot him in the chest," the political instructor snarled. "He was trying to escape." "That's ridiculous," the atheistic doctor snorted. "We have found no bullet. He's in perfect health. Come and see." "But the blood!" The doctor arched his eyebrow in disgust. "You bring a prisoner to the hospital for a cut lip? Impossible," the political instructor shouted. "I know that my man aimed straight at him. He couldn't have missed." The doctor shrugged. "See for yourself." Determined to justify himself, the political officer picked up the package that had dropped to the floor when Carlos's shirt was torn off. "What is this?" "I don't know. I'm not concerned with packages, but with patients." The political instructor unwrapped the package. Inside, he found the Bible. And inside the Bible, he found the spent bullet. "Aha!" he exclaimed, holding up the bullet for the doctor to see. "I told you we shot him in the chest." Timidly, Carlos asked to see the Bible. And strangely, the political officer handed it to him. Carlos opened the Bible and looked through the pages that had been damaged by the bullet. The last damaged page opened onto Psalm 91, and an obvious dimple could be seen in the paper at verse 7. "1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee." "Look at this," Carlos said. The doctor and the political instructor leaned over and looked at the Bible. "See these holes?" Carlos pointed to the damaged pages. "And see this page where the bullet made a dent?" The doctor nodded. "Read those words, right where the dent is," Carlos said. The doctor read the verse, then handed the Bible to the political instructor. Finally he spoke, his voice filled with wonder. "If ever there was a miracle, this is it. Carlos, today the Bible saved your life. For if the bullet had gone all the way through into your chest, you would be a corpse now." The doctor kept the bullet and the Bible, and from then on, at every opportunity, he would call Carlos in for a checkup and talk to him about God. God had taken another of Satan's dastardly tricks and turned it into a blessing. Again, his word had been vindicated. All things do work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. The story of Carlos's miracle spread throughout the prison at record speed. Prisoners who had never shown an interest in anything spiritual showed up for services, hoping to meet Carlos and hear his story. And many of these curiosity seekers met more than the miracle prisoner. They met the Christ behind the miracle. The phenomenal growth of attendance at our religious services forced us to move to the 6th floor. While living on this floor could be hazardous, we had more room in which to conduct our religious meetings, since the lower cells could not hold all of us. Here, we could worship relatively undisturbed. Some of the church members would stand in the entranceway to the cell so that the guards couldn't see what we were doing during our church services. We even managed to smuggle bread out of the mess hall to use for communion. Soon after the incident with Carlos, the prison gossip line informed us that a new prisoner had arrived and would be assigned to our gallery, Marino Bofil. We recognized the name of the former Olympic champion boxer immediately and eagerly awaited his arrival. The story of his arrest and bogus trial had preceded him. While competing in East Germany, Marino had attempted to escape to the West. Caught and shipped back to Cuba, he was tried for crimes against the state and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. While we didn't know Marino, we eagerly greeted him at the door of the gallery as we did every new prisoner. The prisoners met him with the usual barrage of questions regarding the outside world. He patiently answered each one. When we finished, he had questions of his own. Just as the prison gossip told us of Marino's arrival, the story of the Christian prisoner who had been shot in the chest without being wounded had reached him. "Please," he said, "is it true what I have heard? Did a man get shot and the Bible saved his life?" "Yes," I assured him, "it is true. Can I meet him?" Carlos, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped forward. "I am he." He and Carlos took an instant liking to one another. We invited Marino to join us on the 6th floor. Marino surprised us in many ways. Although he boxed for a living, he was a meek and loving individual who hungered after the truth from God's Word. He became active in the young people's group. Day after day, Marino learned more about God's plan of salvation until he decided to join the baptismal class. While studying for his baptism, he also began preparing to become a lay preacher. His enthusiasm and zeal could not be contained. 4 months later, he was one of the candidates for baptism. By this time, God had provided us with our very own baptismal tank. On the 6th floor of each circular was a water tank made of bricks and cement. Each morning, it was filled with water for washing plates and to maintain water when the regular water supply was turned off. Keeping the water clean for a baptism and preventing the guards from observing the ceremony took careful planning. Bathing in the tank elicited a 10-day sentence in the dungeon, and baptizing brought a 21-day sentence. When we were ready to baptize someone, the brothers of the faith would form a line, thus blocking the guard's view of the procedure. We had scheduled Marino to preach his first sermon on Sunday, the next day after his baptism. The word spread throughout the prison. Marino Bofill will preach on Sunday. Accustomed to public appearances as a boxer, the 300 or so prisoners didn't unnerve him in the slightest. He carried off his sermon on David and Goliath with as much style as any seasoned minister. Marino became an overnight celebrity in the gallery. As the prisoners left level 6 after the closing song of that first meeting, we heard them promising one another to return the following week to hear Marino speak. The next week, more prisoners packed level 6. The church grew at an astounding rate. About this time, the church board decided to organize an in-prison university as a witnessing tool. Upon pooling the talent among our members, we decided that we could teach classes in arithmetic, algebra, geography, history, grammar, English, and French. This way, the prisoners would come looking for instruction, and in doing so, perhaps find salvation too. We held the classes in the circular, in the fields, anywhere we had the opportunity. However, Satan and his cohorts never slept. Headquarters grew worried at the sight of so many covert meetings springing up all over the place. They assigned extra guards to scrutinize and report all of our movements. One day, while we worked in the fields, soldiers searched our cells and confiscated all of the books we had borrowed in order to copy our notes, our carefully hidden Bibles, and hand-printed hymnals. Not only did the books represent hundreds of hours of painstaking labor, but they also represented our entire supply of paper. At the end of the day, we learned of the tragedy. The commandant awaited our arrival. "You persist in perpetrating these religious myths. One way or another, we will stop you." In his usual flamboyant manner, he announced the names of the church leaders who would be transferred to other security prisons and concentration camps on the island. "We will divide and conquer." Divide, perhaps. Conquer? Never. We would just have to start all over again. The word of the search and seizure swept through the prison. In the next few evenings, prisoners from all over the gallery arrived on the 6th floor, carrying more paper that had been smuggled into them. "I don't believe it." Antonio stared at the stack of paper before him. Over 5,000 sheets, more than we ever had before. Is God's arm ever too short? "No," I replied. But now comes the hard part, writing out the hymns, the texts, and the lesson books all over again. And who knows how long it will be before it's confiscated again, Carlos reminded. "Ah," Marino interrupted. "This time we must be more careful and wiser. In order to replace all that had been lost as quickly as possible, we organized 3 different copying teams. After returning from the fields at 9 p.m., we took quick showers, ate our meals, and copied until the lights went out. In days, we completed the manuscripts and created new hiding places for them. We had managed to obtain a few books, which ironically included George Orwell's classical works on totalitarianism, the book 1984, and Animal Farm. Our university doors again opened to our eager students. The university's curriculum grew with the arrival of Jose Carreno, a journalism and psychology teacher. We set up a board of education with the following professors: Pastor H. Noble Alexander, University Director, Professor of Mathematics and Algebra; Pastor Luis Rodriguez, Registrar, Professor of Grammar and Oratory; Deacon Jose Carreno, Professor of Journalism, Grammar and Poetry; Deacon Felipe Hernandez, Professor of English and French; Professor Bango, Professor of Philosophy and Humanities. We taught from memory, and from what little we could copy out of the contraband books. We no longer trusted our knowledge to books, since they could again be confiscated. Whenever written materials fell into our hands, we immediately memorized it word for word. Our students did the same. The written word our enemy could destroy, but word committed to memory was ours to keep forever. The more the church grew, the more Satan and his communist cohorts harassed us. During my 4 years at the Isle of Pines, church attendance grew to more than 200 members. The prison officials felt threatened by the potential power of our organization. At the end of one day in the fields, I noticed the corporal in charge of our brigade standing at the edge of the field, speaking in hushed tones to Aldama, our political advisor. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew their exchange could only mean trouble for one of us prisoners. After they had finished speaking, the 2 men walked away in opposite directions. I had just turned my attention back to my task when I heard my number called. "Number 31450, come here. We want to speak with you." I turned and saw Aldama gesturing for me to come to him. We had nicknamed Aldama the grandfather due to his interrogation techniques. To a prisoner's face, Aldama sympathized and spoke gently and affectionately. But after the prisoner left the office, he'd ordered that the man be beaten or killed. "I can't go there," I replied, "because I'll be out of the guard's circle of protection." "But I'm calling you." He elevated his arrogant chin ever so slightly. "Yes, but the guards don't know that," I argued. "When I step out of the circle, they will shoot at me." His eyes flashed with anger. "You're not going to obey?" I shook my head. "On this occasion, I am not. Obeying would cost me my life." His jaw tightened as he clenched and unclenched his fist. "Your disobedience may cost it." I straightened my shoulders and met his gaze. "Well, if you want to kill me, do it here, in the circle, so that you can't say I was trying to escape." "You think you're smart? I could end it all for you with one bullet." He paused to regain his composure. "We'll discuss this problem further this evening." When Aldama called me to the edge of the field, the corporal had gone in the opposite direction to alert the sniper to catch me out of the safety zone. The official report would have indicated that I'd been trying to escape. When the Lord revealed their plot to me, and I refused to cross the line, their scheme to get rid of me without repercussions failed. They were forced to use an alternate plan. That evening, after the counting, a special guard, Corporal Hyenika, hyena in English, was ordered to escort me to the dungeon for my disobedience. Escort doesn't adequately describe his task. Corporal Hyenika's job was to beat me with a machete or prod me with a bayonet point all the way to the dungeon. The corporal added his own touch to the task. He sang a little Mexican tune that said, "Why are you complaining? You yourself looked for evil." Hyenika began singing the tune as he prodded me out into the courtyard with his machete. It had begun to rain, so he ordered me to run, but I continued walking at my normal pace. When we stepped inside the dungeon cell, he growled, "You see how I got wet because of you? I told you to run and you didn't." "I'm not a criminal, so I don't have to run," I answered. "I suppose that I am the criminal." I shrugged. "You said it, not I." Furious at my audacity, he drew his revolver from his holster and shot me in my right thigh. He turned and walked out of the cell as I fell to the floor. Later, the official report stated that I had tried to wrestle the gun from him and it accidentally went off. Fortunately for me, the bullet missed my thigh bone, leaving no permanent damage to my leg. The 90 dungeon cells reflected the brutish, draconian nature of the prison officials. 18 of the cells were tiger cages, suspended like bird cages. The floor, roof, and walls were all made of 3/4-inch steel bars. The 18 monkey boxes were so small that the prisoner was forced to remain in a squatting position with the roof touching his head. The 18 coffin-like showers were vertical. In these, the prisoner was forced to stand on his toes to avoid stepping on the broken glass and nails partially embedded in the back of the shower stall while droplets of water rhythmically pelted his head. The last 36 dungeon cells were solitary confinement rooms. 18 had sleeping facilities and 18 did not. The 18 cells with berths were for those prisoners who would spend months in isolation. At one time or another, I experienced all 5. This time, I was placed in a cell without a berth for 21 days, during which I was not allowed to either shower or shave. Yet even in this pit of degradation, I was not alone. Each evening, at sunset, my brothers in Christ stood outside the building that housed the dungeons and called to me, bidding me good night. When a guard came to release me, I could barely walk due to my leg wound. I was forced to hop on my good leg back to the circular. When I arrived back at my circular, 25 of my brethren welcomed me with a song. "The fight is on, O Christian soldiers." "Stop singing, or we'll shoot," the guards in the tower shouted over their bullhorns. I stood stunned when instead of obeying their order, other prisoners joined in until more than 100 voices filled the circular. My heart overflowed with emotion. I tried to choke back my tears, but I could not. The hero's welcome caused me to forget my injured leg. Somehow, I walked across the circular's open area on both legs. The guards could only sit in their towers and glower. They had been foiled again by the power of Jesus Christ and of Christian solidarity. The Cuban officials decided that the way to break the back of Christianity at the Isle of Pines prison was to transfer various members of the prison church to other prisons in the system. When we first heard the news, we interpreted the move as a tragedy for God's cause. Instead, the dispersion of our brothers to 9 different prisons led to the formation of 9 new churches. God had a way of turning apparent defeat into overwhelming victory. Toward the end of 1965, rumors flew through the prison that all political prisoners would be transported back to the main island, and the common prisoners would take our places in the fields. New prisoners also informed us of strong international pressure being applied on the Cuban government because of the death of Chino Atan, a prisoner who had been killed while working in one of the fields. His death occurred when our political instructor and a sergeant ordered us into the field during a thunderstorm. Lightning struck and killed 3 prisoners, one of whom was Chino Atan. Word leaked out to the international press, stirring up trouble for Castro and his government officials. When we learned the prisoners would be sent back to the main island, we conducted a work slowdown. Unfortunately, the block sergeants sensed the change and intensified their brutality. These soldiers earned their regular army pay plus $2 a day for taking us to the fields. They also earned a sack of whatever we were harvesting on the farms, along with an extra $5 and a 3-day leave every time one of the prisoners opted for the re-education plan. So, it was their goal to make life as intolerable as possible for us in order to convince us to accept the re-education plan. When a sergeant shouted, "Kill!" there would be little hesitation. For if a soldier did not meet his quota, there were dozens more eager to take his place and reap the advantages of the job. While it was difficult to imagine these bloodthirsty ghouls having families to feed, I could understand the conditions that motivated them. In other places of the world, $5 might seem like nothing, but in Cuba, where a citizen could only buy $9.60 worth of goods per month, it was a lot. In addition to the limited purchasing that was allowed, many articles did not arrive in time for the customer to buy them. For instance, the customer might go to the grocery store and request 4 pounds of rice. The clerk in charge would then ask for his consumer booklet to be certain that it was his turn to get rice. After the clerk validated that it was indeed the customer's turn to get rice, he would inform him that there would be no more rice until the next week. When the customer returned the next week for his 4 pounds of rice, the clerk would then look at the consumer booklet and say, "Sorry, last week was your turn. You can't have any this week." Daily, the block officials demanded more and more work out of the inmates. If the prisoners failed to increase their daily quotas sufficiently, beatings and killings occurred. Life in the fields became so unbearable that many inmates mutilated themselves in order to avoid going to work. So each day, there were fewer and fewer prisoners to do the same amount of work. As tensions in the fields increased, one accident after another occurred, either to the trucks or to the farm equipment and at the prison itself. In an effort to break the downward spiral, headquarters developed a new strategy for re-education. First, they renamed the Isle of Pines Youth's Island. Youth's Island would serve a double purpose. It would house political prisoners, and it would be used to separate young people from their parents in order to indoctrinate them, all under the guise of education. If a student applied for a scholarship, he would be sent to a training center far from his parents' home in order to isolate him. He would receive free room, board, and education, and his curriculum included work, study, and weaponry, the skillful use of rifles, bayonets, and handguns. Castro himself welcomed the first 3,000 students to the island, changing the name of the island at that time to Youth's Island in their honor. Barracks were built along with kitchen facilities. The students, both male and female, were organized into blocks just like the prisoners and taken to the fields to work. The only difference was that the students had no guards following them. Unofficially, the Department of Psychology called the plan the sex plan. After 3 years of incarceration, the prisoners were to work side by side with the pretty young female students. Surely, no normal man could resist such a temptation, they reasoned. And should he succumb, the psychologist knew that having lost his moral force, he would be putty in the interrogator's hands. With many men, it worked. However, the majority of the brethren resisted, not through their power, but through the power of community prayer. When it was obvious to our captors that all those who would weaken had weakened, they reassigned the resistors to other blocks. I was assigned to block number 7, the block that worked in the marble quarry, or TB pit, as the prisoners called it. The chief of the block, Lieutenant Rivera, called me into his office. "You are 31450? "Yes," I answered. "I am Umberto Noble Alexander." The number and the name response supplied the officer with a double identification. Rivera nodded. His cold, dark, penetrating eyes revealed no sign of human kindness. "If you do not want to work, just tell me," he started. "I will kill you on the spot." He leaned back on his heels and sized me up. "To begin with, I don't want any preaching here. It's enough with the brainwashing you're carrying on in the circulars." He shook his head in disgust. "I can't understand how Tareo put up with that." Tareo had been the chief of the circulars, or the prison director. "You will work at the quarry beginning tomorrow morning. You are dismissed." I stared straight ahead. Long ago, I had learned not to volunteer information of any kind, never to say no, and not to reveal my true emotions. A guard would knock out one tooth for each no a prisoner uttered. Inside, I shrank from the idea of working at the marble quarry each day from 7 in the morning to 6 at night. During the evening hours, the guards enjoyed harassing the workers by making the prisoners move the stones they'd break in that morning to the opposite side of the quarry, then back again. It wasn't the extreme hard labor, the sweltering heat, the blinding sunlight reflecting off the white marble, or the sadistic games the guards enjoyed playing. It was fear. The fear of dying from the suffocating marble dust and white lime that polluted every breath inhaled. Inmates who worked in the quarry for any length of time usually died from a horrible lung disease. Would my resolve to survive this nightmare be defeated by marbled dust or powdered lime? Would I go out with a gasp or a whimper and never breathe again the sweet perfume of freedom. The end of chapter 10 of I Will Die Free, entitled University Under the Shadows.